The town of Eldermount was a place where reputation spoke louder than words, and appearances often determined one's fate. Nestled between rugged hills and dense forests, the town carried an air of quiet isolation. The cobblestone streets were lined with rows of mismatched buildings, their cracked walls bearing the weight of years gone by. Eldermount's people were fiercely traditional, clinging to age-old prejudices and superstitions that shaped their judgments. In the heart of this town lived a man named Malachi Brown. Malachi was an anomaly in Eldermount. His towering frame, unkempt beard, and weathered face made him the subject of whispered conversations and suspicious glances. His eyes, though kind and gentle, were overshadowed by his rough exterior. Malachi had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember. His home, a small wooden cabin on the outskirts of the town, was as unwelcoming as his appearance, surrounded by tangled vines and overgrown weeds. Malachi's story was one of quiet endurance. Born into poverty, he had known hardship from the moment he took his first breath. His mother had died during childbirth, and his father, a blacksmith with a volatile temper, blamed him for her death. The boy grew up learning to fend for himself, his hands calloused from years of labor, and his heart heavy with loneliness. The townsfolk had never accepted Malachi. They labeled him an outsider, someone unworthy of their trust. Children dared each other to run past his cabin at dusk, spinning tales of ghosts and curses that supposedly haunted the place. Adults avoided him altogether, their biases cemented by his unusual appearance. Yet Malachi was no monster. Beneath the rough exterior was a man of quiet kindness. He spent his days crafting wooden toys for the children who dared approach him and repairing broken tools for farmers who had no one else to turn to. But in a town like Eldermount, goodness was often overshadowed by fear. Chief George Wellington was a man who thrived in the shadows of Eldermount's biases. A judge with decades of experience, he commanded both respect and fear. His courtroom, an imposing stone building at the center of town, was a place where lives were decided with the strike of a gavel. George's reputation was built on his sharp wit and unyielding decisions, but beneath the surface lay a man corrupted by power. George had grown up in privilege. The son of a wealthy merchant, he had been groomed for success from an early age. His education at the finest schools had instilled in him a sense of superiority, and his rise to the position of chief judge only solidified his belief in his own infallibility. But George had a darker side. He harbored a deep disdain for those he deemed inferior, a prejudice that often influenced his rulings. Despite his flaws, George was a man of charisma. His silver tongue and commanding presence made him a formidable figure in Eldermount. He was married to Eleanor, a woman as sharp as he was cunning. Together, they formed a powerful duo, their wealth and influence spreading like roots through every corner of the town. One fateful evening, a crime shattered the fragile peace of Eldermount. The town's wealthiest merchant, Samuel Thornfield, was found dead in his grand mansion. The news spread like wildfire, sending waves of panic through the streets. The people demanded justice, and Chief George was all too eager to oblige. The investigation was swift, but far from thorough. Malachi, with his solitary lifestyle and intimidating appearance, became the perfect scapegoat. Witnesses claimed to have seen him near Thornfield's mansion that night, though none could provide concrete evidence. The town's whispers turned into a roar, and before long, Malachi found himself dragged from his cabin and thrown into a cell. As he sat in the damp, cold darkness of the prison, Malachi's mind raced. He knew he was innocent, but in a town like Eldermount, innocence mattered little. His pleas fell on deaf ears, his voice drowned out by the cry. The courtroom was packed to capacity, a sea of faces alight with curiosity and malice. News of Malachi Brown's arrest had spread far beyond Eldermount, drawing crowds from neighboring towns eager to witness the trial. The case was a spectacle, a tale of crime and justice that fed the public's hunger for drama. But for Malachi, it was the culmination of a nightmare, a moment where he would face the full weight of the town's disdain. Malachi sat at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders slumped, and his hands bound in iron cuffs. His face was an expressionless mask, but his eyes betrayed the storm of fear and despair within. He had no lawyer. The town council had deemed him unworthy of representation. The townsfolk muttered amongst themselves, their words dripping with judgment. "Look at him. He looks like a killer. He's always been strange, always lurking around. If he didn't do it, why was he near Thornfield's mansion that night?" The whispers grew louder as Chief George Wellington entered the room. Clad in his black robes, he strode to his seat with an air of authority that silenced the crowd. His piercing gaze swept over the room before settling on Malachi. There was no trace of doubt in George's eyes, only the cold certainty of a man who had already made up his mind. George Wellington's rise to power had been marked by ambition and ruthlessness. From his early days as a lawyer, he had understood the power of perception. He knew that justice was not always about the truth, but about the story that could be sold to the masses. Over the years, he had honed his ability to manipulate facts and bend the law to his advantage. His courtroom victories were legendary, but they came at a cost. George had made enemies. Families who believed he had sentenced their loved ones unjustly, colleagues who resented his arrogance, and townsfolk who whispered of his corruption. But George cared little for their opinions. To him, the law was a weapon, and he wielded it with precision. In private, George was a man of contradictions. He doted on his two sons, often regaling them with tales of his courtroom triumphs. Yet his relationship with Eleanor, his wife, was strained. She had grown weary of his manipulations, her once admiring gaze replaced by cold indifference. George's home life was a facade of unity, held together by the same force that drove his professional life: control. The prosecutor, Martin Grayson, was a young and eager lawyer who owed his career to Chief George. He approached the case with zeal, painting Malachi as a dangerous outcast who had murdered Samuel Thornfield out of greed. Grayson described the scene of the crime in graphic detail, recounting how Thornfield's body had been found in his study, his head crushed by a heavy candlestick. "We have witnesses," Grayson declared, his voice ringing through the courtroom. 3 individuals saw Malachi Brown near Thornfield's mansion on the night of the murder. His presence there is no coincidence. He had motive, opportunity, and the means to commit this heinous act. The witnesses were called to the stand, one by one. Each gave vague accounts of seeing a shadowy figure near the mansion. None could say with certainty that it was Malachi, but their descriptions, a tall man with a beard and a ragged appearance, were enough to sway the jury. Malachi was given a chance to speak in his defense. He rose slowly, his chains clinking as he moved. His voice was steady but filled with pain. "I didn't do it," he said simply. "I wasn't near that mansion. I was home, carving toys for the children. I have no reason to harm anyone." But his words fell on deaf ears. The jury, composed of townsfolk who shared the same prejudices as the rest of Eldermount, had already decided his fate. As the trial progressed, subtle cracks began to appear in the prosecution's case. An older woman, Abigail Thornfield, Samuel's estranged sister, took the stand. She spoke of her brother's temper and the enemies he had made in his business dealings. "Samuel was not a saint," Abigail said, her voice trembling. "He was ruthless, and many people had reasons to hate him. I do not believe this man," she gestured toward Malachi, "would have had any reason to kill him." Her testimony was dismissed as irrelevant, but it planted a seed of doubt. The tension in the courtroom grew as the trial neared its conclusion. Chief George, sitting high on his bench, was unmoved by Abigail's words. To him, Malachi represented everything he despised, a man who had defied societal norms and lived outside the town's rigid structure. George's own insecurities, buried beneath layers of arrogance, fueled his need to assert dominance. He saw Malachi not as an individual, but as a symbol of disorder that needed to be crushed. As the final arguments were made, George prepared to deliver his verdict. He knew the decision he would make, not because of the evidence, but because of the man standing before him. The air in the courtroom was heavy with tension as Chief George Wellington prepared to deliver his verdict. The townsfolk, leaning forward in their seats, barely breathed as they awaited the outcome. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets, as if nature itself sensed the weight of the moment. Malachi sat with his head bowed, his calloused hands resting on the wooden table before him. He had fought to remain composed throughout the trial, but now, as he awaited judgment, his heart pounded in his chest. He thought of his late mother, of the life he had tried to build despite the odds stacked against him, and of the cruelty that had always followed him because of his appearance. Chief George rose from his seat, his black robes billowing like the wings of a raven. His voice, cold and commanding, echoed through the courtroom. "Malachi Brown," he began, his tone devoid of empathy, "you stand accused of the heinous murder of Samuel Thornfield. The evidence presented, while circumstantial, paints a clear picture. Your presence near the crime scene, coupled with your solitary and suspicious lifestyle, leaves no room for doubt." George paused, letting his words sink in. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a mix of agreement and unease. "I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment," George declared, his gavel striking the bench with finality. The sound was like a thunderclap, silencing the room. "May this serve as a reminder that no one is above the law." The verdict hit Malachi like a physical blow. He was dragged from the courtroom, his chains rattling as the crowd parted to let him pass. Some jeered, others whispered, and a few stood silent, their faces etched with doubt. Malachi was transported to Blackstone Prison, a fortress-like structure perched on the edge of a jagged cliff. The prison was notorious for its harsh conditions, a place where the strong preyed on the weak and hope withered like a dying flame. The guards shoved Malachi into a tiny, damp cell with stone walls that seemed to close in on him. The iron bars were cold to the touch, a constant reminder of his confinement. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as Malachi endured the relentless monotony of prison life. He kept to himself, avoiding the violence that simmered among the other inmates. But even in isolation, he found small acts of humanity. An older inmate named Jacob, who had been imprisoned for decades, befriended Malachi. Jacob was frail but wise, his voice a soothing balm in the oppressive silence. "You don't belong here, son," Jacob said one night as they sat together in the dim light of the cell block. "I've seen men who are guilty, and I've seen men who've been wronged. You're the latter. Don't let this place break you." Malachi clung to Jacob's words, finding solace in their friendship. But the weight of his wrongful imprisonment bore down on him, filling him with a quiet rage that simmered beneath the surface. Back in Eldermount, the repercussions of Chief George's verdict began to unfold. Abigail Thornfield, Samuel's estranged sister, refused to let the matter rest. She began digging into her brother's life, uncovering secrets that painted a very different picture of the crime. Samuel had been involved in shady business dealings, making enemies who had far more motive than Malachi. Abigail's investigation brought her into contact with Nathaniel Blake, a young and idealistic journalist. Nathaniel was known for exposing corruption, and he quickly saw the flaws in Malachi's case. Together, Abigail and Nathaniel began piecing together evidence that pointed to another suspect, a business rival of Samuel's who had been seen arguing with him days before the murder. As the truth began to emerge, whispers of doubt spread through Eldermount. The townsfolk, once so eager to condemn Malachi, now questioned whether they had been too quick to judge. The mounting evidence against the real murderer put Chief George under intense scrutiny. His once untouchable reputation began to crumble as accusations of bias and corruption surfaced. Former cases he had presided over were re-examined, and a pattern of prejudice and negligence came to light. George's own family turned against him. Eleanor, his wife, filed for separation, citing years of emotional manipulation and cruelty. His sons, once proud of their father, now distanced themselves from him. The final blow came when Abigail and Nathaniel presented their findings to the higher courts. The evidence was irrefutable, and a retrial was ordered for Malachi. Malachi's retrial was a stark contrast to his first. This time, he had a competent lawyer who passionately defended him. Witnesses who had been too afraid to speak earlier came forward, revealing the holes in the prosecution's case. After weeks of testimony, Malachi was exonerated. The courtroom erupted in applause as the judge declared him a free man. Malachi, overwhelmed with emotion, wept openly as he was embraced by Abigail and Nathaniel, the people who had fought to clear his name. But justice demanded more. Chief George was stripped of his title and put on trial for his misconduct. The evidence against him was damning, and he was sentenced to prison for corruption and abuse of power. For the first time in his life, George found himself on the other side of the law. Blackstone Prison, the very place he had sent so many others, became his new home. There, he faced the harsh realities of life behind bars, his once powerful presence reduced to nothing. Malachi returned to Elder Mount a changed man. Though the scars of his imprisonment would never fully heal, he found solace in rebuilding his life. The townsfolk, ashamed of their role in his suffering, offered their apologies and support. Abigail and Nathaniel's efforts sparked a movement for judicial reform, ensuring that no one else would suffer as Malachi had. As for Chief George, his days were spent in solitude, reflecting on the choices that had led to his downfall. In the end, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of prejudice and unchecked power.